This is the video for Python selection statements. All right, so in selection statements, this is where we are letting the program choose, or not letting the program choose, but telling the program to choose which path to take, right? And so that's where we're using if or else statements, all right? Now, we're also going to use something called a Gettext Input. So this allows the user to type in a value or a word or something like that. And then this is where, then the program will use that value. All right. And so we're going to start off just showing this. So we're going to use app.getTextInput. All right. And then this is a function. All right. Now, if we run this, all right, it's going to pop up a dialog box and it's going to allow the user to enter some text. All right. Now, the user enters text. Okay, now the way I have it written, nothing happens with that. Okay, now usually in the function, we also put some sort of a prompt like, what is your name, right? And so then when the text box pops up, it's going to say, what is your name? Okay, now if I run this and I type in my name, all right, that's great, but nothing happens with that, right? Because this is just a dialog box popping up. But if I say name equals, now whatever you input here, or whatever the user inputs here, becomes the value of name, right? And so then I can do like a print name, all right? And if I hit run now and I type in my name, now it's going to print the name. Now remember, that's printing in the console, right? Now I could also do like a label or something. So label, and then I can say name, and then at 100, 100, and then let's just run that. So now I can run this, Mr. Bonarigo, right? And I run it. And so now my name is the value of the label, right? Whatever the user happens to type in, which is really nice. All right. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to do some things with conditionals. All right. So let's say that I run this code and I say, okay, what is the weight? All right. And I'm just going to ask the question, how many pounds? Okay, so now how many pounds, right? So now that's going to be put into weight, all right? And so now let's say I wanted to ask, all right, if the weight is greater than 50, all right? So now if the weight is greater than 50, then what do we want to do? Well, then let's print the statement, there is a $25 charge, right? Like let's say we're like flying somewhere, and if the weight of your suitcase is greater than 50, then we're going to print $25 charge, right? So now it's going to run this, right? How many pounds? And let's say I do like 55, right? And I say, okay, now we get an error, right? This would be an example of a runtime error. Why? Well, because when I typed in 55, all right, I was typing in a string, so str, so I was typing in characters like a word, right, and not an integer, right? So what we need to do is we actually need to tell the program what type of variable I'm actually asking the user to type in. Now, I could tell them to type in an int, right, which would be an integer, all right? And so if I do that, I hit run, works the same, but now I type 55, and now it evaluates, right, whether my value that I typed in, 55, was greater than 50, right? And so notice it says there was a $25 charge. Now, let's say I run it again, all right, and now I type in like 40, right, which is less than 50, all right? And so weight greater than 50, that was false, and so line 3 does not execute, and notice there is nothing printed in the console. All right, now int is a way to type in an integer, something that needs to be a whole number, right? So if I said like how many people are going, that has to be an integer, right? But for weight, this is something that could be a decimal. Like couldn't a suitcase weigh like 52.7 pounds, right? And the answer is yes. And so then what we need to do is we need to tell the computer that we're going to type in a float, right? Which means a decimal basically, right? So now if I type this in and I say, okay, how about 52.7 pounds? Now I'm typing in a float. And so once again, that float value is greater than 50. All right. So what happens if I type in 65? Of course, right? There's a $25 charge because 65 is greater than 50. And of course, if I type in 48, then yes, of course, we don't get anything outputted, right? Now, I could also include an else, okay? And so if executes, right? If whatever thing is here, whatever Boolean is here is true, then line 3 will execute, right? Now, if I type else, that means whatever is here will execute whenever this thing was false. All right. So let's say I'm going to print no charge. Okay. Now, if I run this, okay, this is going to give me an error because I don't have quotes around it, right? Quotes or apostrophes, right? And so if I do that, now I run, let's say, 40 uh, 40 pounds. All right. And now we get no charge printed. Okay. So I hit run. All right. Let's say I type 65 once again. I still should get there is a $25 charge. All right. Run again. And let's say I pick 48. And now, of course, no charge. Right. And so we want to make sure that we test it for all of these values. What about 50? All right. What if I type in 50? Well, 50 is no charge. Why? Because I said if weight is greater than 50, right? But if I changed it to greater than or equal to 50, now when I type in 50, what do we get? Well, now we get there is a $25 charge because 50 is now included and would then make this Boolean true. Okay? All right. So now, all right, let's also do something else. Okay. So now notice here the else says print no charge, right? Now, what if I say print thank you? Okay. Now, if I hit run, all right, and I type in something like 65, right, I get there is a $25 charge, right? Because only the stuff inside of the if is going to execute. All right. And if I run and I get 48, now, okay, I get no charge and thank you. Notice thank you also executed because it is inside of the else, right? Notice it's indented. But what if I unindent it? Now it is no longer inside of the if. So what does that mean? Okay, it is going to run no matter which thing is true, right? So if I hit 65, I get there's a $25 charge, right? Which executed because the Boolean weight was greater than 50, right? But then also the print statement for thank you also executes, right? Because it didn't depend on the if or the else. Okay. Now, if I run and I pick something less than like 48, all right, now I get no charge, but I also get thank you as well, right? Because thank you is going to execute no matter what. Okay. So that is important, okay, to remember. Okay. All right. Now let's do something else. Okay. So I have an if weight is greater than 50, okay? But now let's use something else called an else if, all right? And that is else if, all right? So let's say, okay, now what if the weight is greater than 100, all right? And then we say else if weight, if I could spell, weight is greater than 50. Okay, now what do we want to do if weight is greater than 50? All right, so let's say if weight is greater than 100, there is a $50 charge. If weight is greater than 50, there is a $25 charge, let's say. All right, and then once again, okay, print thank you, but what about if it's less than 50, right? So now we can use an else here and say print no charge. Okay, and it would be helpful if I could spell. All right, so now if I run and I pick something greater than 100, like 105, right? It's going to print there's a $50 charge, right? But then it also prints thank you. All right, if I hit run and I pick something in between 50 and 100, like 72, I run and it says there's a $25 charge, right? But then also prints thank you. All right, and then if I run and I pick something like 33, right? Now it says no charge, and then but it also says thank you. All right. And so that's pretty much it. Now, one other thing that I do want to make sure that you understand is, what if I don't use an else if? What if I just use an if here, right? If I use an if, right, and I pick something like 105, right, I get there's a $50 charge, but I also get there's a $25 charge. Why? Because, well, the weight of 105 is still greater than 50, right? And so what does that mean? That this is going to execute. So if you don't want to ask this question, then that's when you need to use an if or an else if. All right, so that is selection statements.